So welcome everyone to another Transatlantic Poetry on Air reading. My name is Robert Peake, creator of the series, and I'm really excited to have Robert Harper of Bear Fiction hosting tonight's show. Robert?
Hello there. Hi, Robert. Thanks very much for getting me to get involved this evening. So I'm Robert Harper, editor of Bear Fiction magazine, which most of you will hopefully know publishes plays and poetry as well as fiction. I'm talking to you from Shropshire in England, and I'm just ridiculously excited to be involved with Robert Peake's Transatlantic Poetry series to bring you two readings by poets that Bear Fiction has been fortunate enough to include in its pages in its short life so far. We've got the American poet and playwright Dan O'Brien, who appeared in our first issue back in December last year, and the British poet Rebecca Goss, whose work appears in our current issue. And both poets will be reading for roughly 15 minutes each this evening for you, and they tell me that they're predominantly sharing brand new poetry with you, so that is very exciting indeed. And there's Dan now. He'll be with us in a second. After we've had the readings, I'll be asking Dan and Rebecca some of the questions that you've shared online. And if you've got some questions for our Q&A session, which will last about 20-25 minutes after both the readings have happened, do put those online, and Robert Peake's going to help me out and make sure that I get some of those over to Dan and Rebecca for you afterwards. What I would like to do is just introduce to you the poetry first and foremost now. So first up we've got poet Dan O'Brien. Dan has had a long relationship with writing poetry, but his career in theatre has until recently dominated his time and meant that his poetry was more of a private release from what he called the marketplace mentality of theatre. And happily for us, his debut collection, War Reporter, from CB Editions and Hanging Loose Press, was published last year, and it was shortlisted for the Felix Dennis Prize for Best First Collection, and it won the Fenton Aldeburgh First Collection Prize last year. So from Los Angeles, I'd like to introduce Dan O'Brien. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to apologize for just sitting here on screen while you're introducing me, but I seem to be having some technical difficulties with my cursor. I guess the timing couldn't be more perfect, but I can still read, and I'm excited too. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be reading with Rebecca. And so I'll start. This is the first poem from the collection War Reporter. I'm going to read a few from that poem and then from that book, and then I'm going to read a selection of new poems that I'm still writing about and with Paul Watson. This is the first poem. It's called, you know what, it just disappeared. All right, I guess I'm going to be doing this the old-fashioned way with an actual book. So this is the first poem from the collection. This is called The War Reporter Paul Watson Hears the Voice. We asked them, have you seen the American soldier? Someone says he saw him tied up in a wheelbarrow. I take a picture of children bouncing on a rotor blade in the smoldering wreckage of the Black Hawk. Has anyone seen the dead American soldier? The mob parts around me. I look down in the street, and I meet the man. When you take a picture, the camera covers your face. You shut the rest of the world out. Everything goes dim, and I hear a voice, both in my head and out. If you do this, I will own you forever. I'm sorry, but I have to. If you do this, I will own you. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to desecrate your memory. If you do this, I will own you forever. I took his picture while they were beating his body and cheering, some spitting, some kid wearing a chopper crewman's goggles, face screwed up in rapturous glee while giving the dead man the finger. An old man's raising his cane like a club and thudding it down against the dead flesh. Man holding the ropes that bind the dead man's wrist or stretching his arms out over his head, rolling him back and forth in the hammering morning light. I'm standing outside myself. I'm watching someone else take these pictures, wondering, you poor man, who are you? Am I still connected? Can you hear me?
We can indeed. You're doing great, Dan. And sorry for the mouse. I'll mute you out during Rebecca's set and
Let me know.
take care of that for you.
Seriously, my computer's doing some strange things right now, so I can't see anything. So I will continue to read on faith.
You're looking and sounding good to us, so carry on. Thank you.
Okay. Here's another poem from the book. This is called "The War Reporter Paul Watson on Suicide." On a bed, we discover the body of a child at the bottom of a pile of children, quartered like chickens. Outside, another's buried alive. The hand is like a tuber. At the refugee camp, a girl stumbles barefoot into a ditch of corpses, some wrapped in reed mats, looking for help, crying, but nobody's coming. I say to myself, this will make a great picture. This is a beautiful picture somehow. Raising my camera to my face, I step on a dead woman's arm. It snaps like a stick. In the Arabuye, we push open a gate on a courtyard of hell, tangles of limbs jumped. They'd come to this church hoping God would protect them, but it only made things that much easier to be hacked to pieces. The survivor shivers on the filthy foam. The mayor asked for wallets, tossed them grenades. Men blown into pieces in midair. These are snakes whose heads must be crushed. Neighbors took neighbors' children and bashed their heads together till brains strewed the dirt. Infants keening beside their decapitated mothers were plunged head first into latrines. A pregnant friend slit open and her fetus extruded like a docile calf. There was so much noise, the survivor recalls. All I wanted was to close my ears and lay on the ground and sleep in my family's blood till her skin itched with maggots, then 40 days cowering in the charnel church, praying I'd be killed too, because I believed the world had been swept away. Of course I've wanted to kill myself before, writes the war reporter to the poet, but the truth is I lack the courage. So I tell myself, just go someplace dangerous. Let somebody else kill you. This next poem somewhat explains how I started working with Paul Watson in the first place, now 7 years ago, so 8 years ago almost. It's called The Poet Hears the Voice. In Princeton, the leaves change like bells. Squirrels pass untouchable girls, stalking the greens at night, worth something, running in lightning storms, peeling paint from balusters along the Victorian porch, sipping vodka, neat, cooking meat over charcoal, watching the unified mind of the swallows come careering out of the twilight into our backyard maple tree. I tend to be solitary. Dinner parties, I prefer to stay away. This is you speaking, though it might as well be me. I've spent my life with war reporters, and I'll count myself foremost in this group. Everyone's a mess of insecurities, looking for self-esteem to risk. A hangar-sized Whole Foods besides a glinting field of Priuses while you're off in Kandahar, or is it Baghdad, Paul? I'm sick of being lied to, so I simply take it as a challenge to find the truth. My father cursing me, there are things you do not know. My mother not turning her mausolean face to say goodbye. Picking up our lives at the end of summer, I swear I heard a demon hiss, don't leave us, please. If something's risky and we probably shouldn't do it, I'll say, don't worry about me. I'm already dead. The blind mob is calling. You poor man, who are you? This is when I was going to read a few of the newer poems. Let's see if I can make my computer cooperate here. It's not looking like it. Oh, wait, here we go. Okay, something's happening. All right, I'm going to read a few of the new poems. They've been published in Bear Fiction and a few other journals here and there. It seems to be turning into a new book. We'll see if someone is foolish enough to publish it. This is called The War Reporter Paul Watson Bids His Joy Farewell. Most of these poems are about Paul Watson's time in Syria in the past year or so, 2 years. Over FaceTime with his son complaining about math, the cat's diarrhea, those dire choral concerts, Paul mentions he'll be gone a week or so. So what? who posts his son with a wit half his age, knowing full well no Wi-Fi is murder. To Syria, Paul persists the betrayal. The young bloods on Pandora, we are but a moment's sunlight fading in the grass. His joy asks, why do you have to? Just stay. Twisting off-screen strangles tears in the window's veil of skiers. Paul's hotel window unveils a surf at Burj Hamid, the squalor of the Scotch in his tumbler. The near future will often bleed through. Like this 9-year-old girl in a hospital because shrapnel from a mortar bomb pierced the tent and speared an aluminum vessel like a balloon atop their space heater. Smuggled diesel inside usually, but now refugees must burn raw crude. Purchased like molasses and repurposed Coke cans. The girl's father had dribbled in some kerosene to cut the ribbons of billowing tar. The flames splashed over her cheek, her arm. Her mother tried to smother the screaming, but only smeared the searing goo farther in an ear that simply disappeared. Now, like a stone molded over with the moss of silver sulfadiazine cream, caked on to ward off sepsis, fracturing like plaster. The ungloved nurses peeled the gauze. Assad's bombardment reminds the city. The half-deaf girl sobs, chasing a crowded hallway. This moment gets photographed tomorrow. I'll return one day, Paul promises. But when I don't make it back, all you'll need to do is go up the mountainside and ask the forest whether to ask out that girl. Ask the rain how to finesse your mother. Ask the storm if you can borrow his car. They're laughing between their laptops. Promise me. His son gambles. Fuck off. The song on Pandora switches to something less meaningful as they disconnect. Water. So I want to read another one, but it seems to have disappeared again. Okay, here we go. Apologize for this, guys. It adds a little bit of excitement, though. All right, it's disappeared again from my screen. Oh, it's back. Okay. This is another new one. This is called The War Reporter Paul Watson to the Readers from Aleppo. Humor is as common as blood on the street outside the restaurant Al-Quds, Arabic, for Jerusalem. Bat-like chickens roasting and respiring flames, for broken spirits without power, the shape in the doorways bellowing. Every time reporters come, Al-Assad bombs us. Forgive me, I cry, before noticing the shadows laughing at me. This man also, while delivering this bundle like a football through the door wrapped in greased newspaper, bones sucked clean of their measly meat around the corner at a desolate clinic when a snarling boom shifts the room. My translator's seller. I say we have a saying in Canadian, lightning never strikes twice, as the door explodes open and barking men are delivering the lowing heap of that joker who gave me chicken. Like Christ salvaged from the crucifixion, naked feet micturating, blood, eyes, and the gas-generated fluorescent light don't see me, his double, focused between shoulders on tracksuits, stonewashed denim, blood that spat onto linoleum tiles, snailed ointment tubes, husks of gauze wrappers, crushed buffering boxes, saline bags depleted, two-way radio squawks the driver's hand to life, blood-brined cheeks had been bobbing as if dozing. A gay nurse in his pink-collared sweater swaddles the chicken man, heel to ankle, staunches a hemorrhaging mother, whose firstborn pales in its father's arms while the grandmother spots through her threadbare hijab. Dear readers, I would remind myself to remind you to pay attention, but I was the one lusting for chicken, which is why I missed the point of the joke in the dark. Read another new one or newish one. The war reporter Paul Watson on the stones of Tahrir Square. Imagine David versus Goliath in riot gear. Tear gas and concussion grenades, cudgels, of course. A medieval surge, foot by bloody foot, then bullets. Jets taunting, then opening wide the gates of jails for murderers and rapists. Protesters made shields out of cardboard and twine, twisted railings for barricades, corrugated tin warping and gonging in the wind. Stones were harvested from craters. Even more stones exhumed from garden walls. Protesters traveled with their trowels, leaving flowers exposed as food for boots and sun. More stones stolen from construction sites. Pockets, handbags, suitcases too, prying the stones loose from the curb, erasing the fingerprints on the hands that threw them. When 18 days had passed, protesters were replacing stones in the garden walls, and the new country had begun to look a lot like the old country again. Let's see here. This is another of the new poems. I don't. These are all somewhat terrifying to read because they're so new. But this poem seems to be somewhat depressingly timely with the decapitation of James Foley recently. It's called The War Reporter Paul Watson Prefigures the End. Have you thought about it? You should. Watch it on your computer. You won't be the same after. Or you will be, and that will be your problem. If I were you, Dan, I'd cling to life. Most everybody would. Your child deserves the splendid world. The temptation is what you failed to mention. Your own eyes roiling in her mother's face, a table between you and Carmel by the sea, blessed with the air of a classicist, copper-colored ringlets, depressive, passionately decoding your codex, and what have you become? A ghost? As they're laying the knife against your throat, will you thank them? I will giggle like Gandhi, slyly perverted with pride they'll presume. I'll forgive them when they slice my skin, snap sinews and larynx and gullet and spine, carotid arteries spraying like pinched hoses while I'm calling in a drowning gibberish for this cup to pass my lips. I won't believe it, and neither should you, my friend, as they string me up like a biblical scapegoat, and oh, never mind the blood and war. I'll have gone into that dangling bulb and sinking sun in this land where all trouble began, the cradle, don't they call it? The cradle of man. I'll read one more. I think my time is close to being up. This is the very end of the published collection, The War Reporter. It's a poem that's made up of dialogue, really. So in some ways it's like a scene in a play. It's two voices. It's Paul Watson calling the family of the soldier he photographed in Mogadishu to apologize, to seek forgiveness of some kind. And he got in touch with the soldier's brother. It's called The War Reporter Paul Watson is Forgiven. I'm gonna have to ask you not to call my mother anymore. Well, sir, it's just that I've been fighting this thing for years. You mean that picture you took of my brother drugged through the street? That's right. And I'm hoping if I can just understand my place in time and his place in time, then maybe we could bury a few things. He was just this kid who didn't match in with nobody, but he always knew he wanted to protect people. Was your father in the Navy, sir? He was an engine mechanic. And did your father have a wife? Well, he had a couple of them. And you wouldn't know how I might go about trying to track down these women or other relatives? Nope. He had a few kids, I understand. What? He had some children. Now, are you looking to do some kind of story again? Sir, I just wish we could meet. I don't care to meet you at all. Do you hate me? Sorry? You hate me. I know it, sir. I don't hate anybody, man, but I dishonored your brother. That's what haunts me. His honor wasn't tarnished in the least. Well, sir, see, a lot of people would argue with you on that point. And they must not have been one of the 3,000 people that crowded into the church that could hold only like 100 for his funeral. Must not have been one of the 32 cars following us all the way to the cemetery, or the 4 helicopters with gunships giving him an escort from above. They didn't feel he'd been dishonored. Others who know him from my picture. I don't care about your picture. I'm not interested in discussing it. I'm not interested in meeting you, and I do apologize if that offends you, sir. Could we just do this over email, sir? No. Can't we just meet and you can see who I am? Once again, negative. Sir, I have begged. I don't understand why. You're going to have to figure that out on your own. Your mother hates me, sir, because I read an interview about what happened in Fallujah when those American contractors got strung up from a bridge, and your mom broke down and told the reporter she hates the person who did it then, just like she hates the people who do it now. She was talking about the people who were desecrating them bodies. No, sir, she was talking about me, sir. I know it. The thing of it was, we found out while watching Peter Jennings, when my mother recognized my brother's feet because they looked just like his dad's. You must blame me for that much. Man, you don't listen very well, do you? Do you want to know why I did it? No. Why not? Explaining don't change the fact the thing got done. The week before, another Black Hawk got shot down, and kids were parading the body parts of servicemen through the streets like pennants at a baseball game. And the Pentagon denied it. They said it didn't happen because I didn't have a picture. Right. I wasn't a machine. I cared. Right. And honestly, sir, I believe your brother would still be alive today if people had known the truth. For my own life, I'd say, and I was in the Air Force for 10 years, I volunteered to go to Somalia, but they wouldn't let me because of my job where I was, and I can honestly say I'd have no problem if I'd been the one in my brother's shoes. You would have wanted that picture taken? I would have. Why, sir? For the reason I just explained, for both reasons. What you just said and just because you were doing your job. Well, I'm grateful to you for saying that. Not a problem. It takes a weight off my back, but I wish the rest of your family felt the same way. You're going to have to take my word on that, unfortunately. Oh, yeah, no, I won't go down that route, sir. I appreciate that, sir. I'm just talking about the larger world here, because I don't think most people out there understand. Well, the world's fucked up. Yeah, short and sweet, the world's a fallen place. I hope this won't upset you too much, but one thing that still haunts me is that I heard a voice when I took that picture, and your brother warned me. If you do this, I will own you forever. Well, how do you know David meant something bad? He said, I will own you forever. Maybe he meant you owe him something now. Like what? Look, I got to go pick up my son. Okay, sir, I forgot to ask your name. Ray. Ray. That's my father's name. Sir, please apologize to your mother for me. Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Dan. That was just such a pleasure to have you reading for us. You know, despite your technical difficulties with the computer, that was an absolutely delightful reading. Thank you very, very much indeed for sharing those with us.
Thank you. It was an honor to read, and I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties. I'll try not to pop in and out now for the rest of this talk.
Well, we'll come back to you again a little bit later after we've had Rebecca's poems, and we'll. I've got some questions that have come in from a few people that I'll pose to you about the collection and about the how that connects with the play as well, The Body of an American. And just for people that don't know, the play The Body of an American that Dan has written, it's been on in the UK earlier this year at the Gate Theatre, and it's going to be at the Wilma Theatre in Philadelphia, that's right, in January next year.
Yes, that's right.
And of course is going to be over at the Aldeburgh Poetry Festival in November of this year, so in the UK, so people in the UK can get to listen to Dan in the flesh rather than over the screen. Okay, Dan, I'll talk to you in a little while.
Okay, thanks.
So next up we have, well, in keeping with the title of this series, from this side of the Atlantic, coming to us live from Suffolk in England, we have Rebecca Goss. She has a pamphlet called Keeping Houston Time, which was published by Slow Dancer Press, which came out in 1997. Her first full-length collection, The Anatomy of Structures, was published by Flambard Press in 2010. However, Rebecca, just like Dan O'Brien, for me, I read for the first time after coming across their names in the Forward Prize shortlist last year, in which Rebecca's second book of poems, Her Birth, was shortlisted for Best Collection 2013. And Her Birth was, for me, one of those rare collections that I found myself unable to put down and read. Well, I read it from cover to cover in one sitting. I'm delighted that Rebecca is here as well with us this evening to share some new poems. And if Rebecca, if you're ready, I'd like to introduce you and listen to some poems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert. Hello, I'm going to start with some new poems and then read 3 from Her Birth. The first poem is was inspired by a walk on the promenade in Liverpool that runs alongside the River Mersey. I lived there for 20 years and lived very close to the river and walked on the prom a lot, either with a dog or a baby. And one day I was walking and two middle-aged men jogged past me, and they were laughing. And I remember thinking that their laughter sounded successful, or rather it sounded like the laughter of successful men. I can't really explain it any more than that. Anyway, I spent the rest of my dog walk making up lives for them. It's called Jogging with Roger. He likes the choreography, how they convene for synchronized stretching before pounding in tandem, all set to the reassuring bounce of their cocks. The talk is of money and risk, money and luck, and though he never looks at his long-time neighbour, he knows Roger is sweating, his face turning puce. Roger doesn't know the details of his life, that he thinks about sex most of the day, will return home to shower, wear yesterday's shirt, smell the tang of his assistant still on his cuff. He wonders if Roger likes to taste sweet, weak women, if Roger has secrets too. He thinks about Julia, staked on a lounger, honeying her limbs, how he pretends not to notice Roger's spectacular wife. They circle the oak on Oak Tree Drive, pant the last stretch home, their finish rewarded by the first glare of sun. As they bend to grip knees, he notes their heavy watches, the year-round tan to their arms, but it's the ring of grey sticky on Roger's scalp that renders him stricken, knowing it mirrors his own, leaves him wheezing on concrete in another day's light. This next poem is forthcoming in an anthology called Other Countries, Contemporary Poets Rewiring History. It's edited by Gareth Pryor and Claire Trevian, and the brief was to take a piece of history and rewrite it, rediscover it, retell it in some way. I was inspired, the inspiration for my poem came from being in the local library with my daughter, and noticing a book about the artist Marc Chagall in the children's section, an illustrated book. And when I opened it, I saw a picture of a young woman sitting upon a huge crate, and that crate was on a deck of a ship. And what I discovered from reading the book is that when the artist Marc Chagall escaped Nazi-occupied France in 1941 and sailed for America, it was actually his daughter Ida who ensured the safe passage of her father's paintings. She gathered them all up. She was responsible for getting them all crated. And so protective was she of her father's paintings that she sat on top of the crate for the entire journey, and I admired her for this and warmed to her hugely. So my poem is about Ida. Ida and the box. Ida, with your 600 kilos of gathered Chagall, passengers stare at your straight back, your flat palms pressing on the crate. Behind you there is fire, not smouldering in hearths, but started in homes to raise them. This crossing of frontiers brings you to sit on a box lashed to the deck, your hull guarded and close. Thank God, because you weren't to know the hold was already damp, rotting its contents to an insanitary state. Brooklyn port authorities would enter its stench, throw everything overboard. Waves pick up the hull, urge this passage on. You can hear the acrobat tumbling, the green head of the poet revolving with ideas. You listen for the swish of your parents in flight, the birthday kiss where your life germinated in a posies spray. Ida, with your body's freight of water and bone, push down, keep still, these animals and angels you have tamed into dark. The next poem is also forthcoming in a new anthology. This time titled, the anthology is titled Furies, and it's edited by Eve Lacey, and is going to be the first publication from For Book's Sake, and all profits will be going to Rape Crisis. If you look it up and look at their website, you'll see that it is a poetry collection of poems about wronged and revolutionary women. And the brief for all those who submitted was to pick a fury, whether she be from history or myth or legend or literature or contemporary culture, and write about her. I chose a television character from an American television series called Mad Men. Now, I'm fully aware Mad Men is either something people really like, really dislike, or know nothing about. But to briefly explain, my poem is about Betty Draper, and she's married to the protagonist of the series, Don Draper. It's set in 1950s, 60s America, and he runs a very successful ad company, and he's charismatic and charming and very, very unfaithful. And she is his wife, bringing up his 2 children in the suburbs. She's very beautiful, she's very angry, she is flawed, and she is complex. And we're not always meant to like her in the series, but I really liked her in this particular scene that I've written about, which is my favourite scene in Mad Men, when she takes revenge on her next-door neighbour, dressed in nothing but a nightgown. And if you actually type in the title of my poem into YouTube, you can actually see the scene that I'm talking about. Betty Draper shoots at her neighbour's pigeons. Gone noon, in ivory nightgown, one lucky strike jutting from her mouth, she tips up the gun and aims at their swooping grace. The crack that comes rouses the man who threatened her children's dog, his remaining birds now panicked in their cage. She keeps firing, sheer sleeves slipping to her elbows, and maybe there's a shot in there for Don, her husband's absences at night. Maybe a shot for motherhood too, and the era that keeps her pinned in the home like a butterfly with her rioting young. The hours of dishes, laundry, all of it accomplished with that silent, divine face. On a flawless lawn, gloss nails on the trigger, Betty Draper shoots at her neighbour's pigeons, and she's smoking the whole time. This poem is in the current issue of Bare Fiction, issue 3, edited by the lovely Robert Harper, who's hosting this evening. I'm very pleased to have 4 poems in the latest issue. My parents were both turned 65 this year, and they had a party to celebrate. But the celebration was really more to do with the fact that they had known each other for 50 years. And I'm the eldest of 4, and my younger sister wanted us to all speak and say something at the party, so I was instructed to write a poem, and this is the poem. They won't mind me saying their relationship has been somewhat roller coaster. They married young, had 4 children, they got divorced, then they lived in sin for a bit, as my mum called it, and then they married each other again. So they are destined to be together. They are meant to be. And when my sister said, write a poem about them, we all know the story of their beginning, my siblings and I. And there is something so simple about it. They were 15 years old. It was on a warm summer's evening in a garden in East Anglia, where they went on to spend the rest of their lives. And I just wanted to write about that, their simple beginning. There was a swing, and my father claimed it. His teenage frame leant into the rope, links of chance around him. A friend called Pip, Pip's garden, the liberty of summer. She came through gates, poised herself on the lawn, and from his sway my father saw my mother. How long he waited before he rose, I don't know, but as the party began its swell, the blonde boy wandered to the red-headed girl. Her beauty was outright and everywhere, in her hair, her freckled arms, in skin that still held the day's heat. Eloquent, head cocked, he made her laugh until she slowed his burgeoning swagger with her voice, its gentleness. They danced most of the night, this girl, this boy, both of them still at school, a marriage unimagined, a home unmade, their children stars away, magical and unknown. I'm going to finish with three short poems from my collection, my latest collection, Her Birth, which is about my daughter Ella, who was born in 2007 with a very rare heart condition and severe Ebstein's anomaly, and there is no cure. She lived for 16 months. The book is split into three sections, the first being from her birth to her death. The middle section is about my life without her, and the final section is about the birth of my second child, Molly, who was born happy and healthy in 2010. I'm going to read three short poems that really sort of concentrate on losing her and life without Ella. The first is the title poem, because it is her beginning and end in one poem. That's what I wanted to try to do. Her Birth. On the wall, petunias, painted in Walberswick. I call to you, say, that's a good omen, that's a good sign, before buckling, gripping the hospital bed. Walberswick is where I holidayed every childhood summer. It's where we announced the news. 16 months after the effort of her birth, we collect a faux walnut box from Jenkins and Sons. Inside, a clear sachet, weightless as dried herbs. We drive 281 miles for that cold, unstoppable wave to suck the sachet clean, and I ask you, she is all right now, isn't she? She is all right. Of the many, many things I miss about Ella, one of them is holding her. She never crawled or walked. The doctors and nurses who looked after her at Alder Hey, we never quite worked out whether that was to do with her condition or whether she just really couldn't be bothered to crawl or walk. And my second child never actually walked till she was 18 months old, so we never quite know, but she did get very tired, especially as she got older. So I carried her everywhere, just carried her, and she was most comfortable with her head there on my shoulder and her chest leaning on my chest, which I have been told by a nurse at Alder Hey is a very comfortable way for heart babies to sleep. It helps their breathing when their bodies are forward like that. So when I think about her and when I miss her, it is that mass of small child. That's what I miss and I crave, and this poem is trying to explain that. Muscovado sugar. I reach for the new kilogram bag, slick with plastic wrap, clutch its bulk in both hands. She weighed the same as 8 of these at the time of her death. The mass her father carried to intensive care, flanked by medics gifting oxygen to her lips, and I walk behind, able to see her crown, her father's competent back, conscious of my arm, of someone's grip. I should scissor this bag open, ease crystal heaps onto scales, but I'm stuck in an imaginary stacking. 8 bags cradled elbow to elbow, her cardinal number stretching across my breast, carried up the stairs to lie down on the bed, pull the covers over us. Imagine her yielding. Imagine her move. And my final poem this evening is about euphemisms, and I actually don't think I use them very much in the context of talking about Ella. I'm not afraid to say my daughter died or the death of my daughter, but one particular day I did use this euphemism, and as soon as I heard myself say it, I was struck by how inadequate it sounded. Lost. Walking with my baby in the park and slowing for someone I hadn't seen in years, I heard myself interrupting coos to say, "You know I lost my first child, don't you?" As if there were a possibility she might turn up again with my glove or best pen. That a sweep of the sofa might reward me her hand, then body, pulled from the gap between cushions. As if all I did was lose sight of her. That an anxious scan of sand could bring her into focus, squat and peering at shells. As if I could swear I had hold of her earlier, that a frantic spill of my bag would bear lip gloss, chewing gum, keys, and I'd be unable to explain, apologizing for my dreadful mistake. As if one day I could run from my house screaming found, lift her for the whole road to see, shouting, here she is, she is here. And thank you very much indeed, and I really enjoyed listening to Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that lovely, very, very moving reading of your poems. And thank you, of course, to Dan for reading earlier. Now we're going to go to the Q&A sort of section of the evening for another 20 minutes or so, something like that, to round us off for our whole hour. And as you've just been reading there, Rebecca, I got my first question to you, if you don't mind, and it's from Maggie in Scotland, who'd like to ask you about your editing approach when you've been writing such intimate material about your child's death and so on, and how you approach that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's sort of lots of processes going on at once, really, of not really wanting to censor anything, to tell it exactly how it was. Though that took quite a long time coming, and it took me a while to realise that I had to sort of cancel out the audience in a way and just consider what I wanted to write down and not worry about upsetting anyone or offending anyone. And also, when you get to the editing stage and the fine-tuning, it's quite an uncomfortable feeling getting to the stage when you sort of like the poem about your dead daughter, because it's finished and it's right, but I also wanted to make sure that they were strong poems and that they stood up on their own as well as in a sequence, and so I was quite good at looking at them like I wrote my first book in a way, just honing them down and making sure they were good poems. Once I'd got the story down, or the part that had happened, then I found it all right to work on them like that, because I wanted to do them justice.
Sure. So when you came to the end of writing the poems and you felt that they were at a good point, and then you're handing them over to your editor at Carcanet, and they're looking at them and making further decisions on them, was that tough?
It was interesting. I had two editors, John Glover from Carcanet Northern House, and then Helen Tukey, the general managing editor at Carcanet. And John was fantastic, and he went through the manuscript line by line, and he's followed the Ella poems closely for years. But Helen, when she first read it, sent me an email to say, I feel a bit awkward about changing this line or suggesting this, because of the subject matter, and I did really stress to her, you mustn't do that. I want you to really whip this book into shape, and she did, and sorted it out, and lots of fine tuning, which I was really grateful for, and told her that she wasn't to treat me differently from any of the other poets on the list or the other manuscripts she was looking at, despite the subject matter.
It's a very brave sort of thing to be able to do. I got another question that I'll pose to you, actually. This is from Sina from Alabama, who asks, when did you discover that you were a poet?
Me, to Rebecca.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
I don't know. I like to think I wasn't one of those pretentious sort of 12-year-olds walking around saying I want to be a writer, but I have a feeling I may have been. I did know that I wanted to write from a very young age, but I actually just wanted to be a short story writer for a long time, and I still think I am a frustrated short story writer. But I wrote a lot of short stories as a teen, and yeah, and also, and I wasn't I wasn't an all-rounder at school. I just loved English. I loved reading. It was my favourite subject, and yeah, so I just I knew that writing would be in my life somewhere.
So right from school age, and then of course you went to university, and then your first pamphlet came out in the late 90s.
Yes, yeah, a bit too early really, because there was no internet then, and I hadn't had much published, and no bugger knew who I was. So then I had to spend 10 years starting again, really, building up a reputation.
Well, I'm glad you have done. I'm gonna take a question over to Dan now. If Dan, are you there?
Yeah, let me just get my. There we go.
You back on with us with a picture?
Yes, And sound. Can you hear me?
Picture and sound, great. I'll ask you that question as well, Dan, from Sina. When did you discover that you were a poet? Because you say to me when we talked earlier last year that you've been writing poetry at the same time as being a playwright, and they've sort of been,
I think I was also that pretentious 12-year-old who was writing poems, and it started with poetry. That's why I've always felt like there's something kind of fundamental about poetry, maybe in general, but for me, even though I sort of went off into a playwriting career of sorts for 10 or 15 years, but yeah, it started quite young, and it started young in a way that helps me relate to what Paul Watson does, because even very young, I came from a very dysfunctional family full of repression and secrets, and writing at the age of 12 was about telling the truth, finding a safe place to tell a dangerous or taboo truth, and that's sort of the most fundamental way in which I relate to what Paul Watson does, and it's in some ways it's a silly comparison because I identify with what he does on very domestic and humdrum levels. And he deals with the question of truth and taboo in terms of politics and life or death events. But no, so I started very young, and the poets that meant a lot to me were the poets like Rebecca who need to and choose to tell the truth about something very important that can be quite scary or frightening, but when done well, it's beautiful. It's a real solace.
So I'm going to bring in a question that Maggie from Scotland asked as well for you there, Dan. It's similar to Rebecca's question she asked for Rebecca, is how did you manage to distance yourself from those experiences that Paul Watson had when you're talking to him and then writing your version of his events as a poetry? How did you keep that?
At first, when I first got in touch with him, I'd heard him on the radio, and I was just struck by his voice. I was struck by the ghost story element, the fact that he felt literally haunted by the spirit of this soldier. And then I read his memoir. His memoir had come out in 2007, and it was overwhelming at first. I mean, I hadn't been a political writer. I didn't write about that sort of thing usually. And his memoir is a chronicle of 25 years of visiting, of Paul chasing after, like all combat journalists, chasing after trauma and experiencing trauma quite often. So when I first, started working with him, I didn't know if I could. I didn't know if I could write something with and about him. And I think it was slowly getting to know him better. We probably spent about 2 years just kind of as pen pals, emailing each other while he was in different places and I was in different places. And then eventually we met up in the Arctic. He was doing a story. He was trying to transition out of war reporting and cover the Arctic for the Toronto Star. And I met him there. And that was the first time I'd actually spoken to him face to face. We'd spent a few years writing quite often to each other. But this was the first time we'd spoken to each other face to face. And by then, maybe it was simply I was somewhat desensitized to the material. It's still quite difficult at times, but at the same time, it gives me a great sense of purpose or value beyond myself and my ego. Even though, of course, myself and my ego is in there somewhere. The fact that through him, I'm able to try to write about these very important events and has helped. And also, I think putting the focus on the civil rights aspect of these, or the human rights aspect of these stories, is a way that I can see the trauma in a more productive or positive light, and not so much, dwell on the what's ugly and disturbing about a lot of the stories.
I mean, there's been so much sort of that you've managed to get out of all those memoirs and your discussions with him. I mean, you've got a collection of War Reporter, you've got a lot more poems coming, as you say, War Reporter 2, should we, in a sense. The play Body of an American, and chamber opera as well. And I've got a question here. It's just disappeared on my screen. Here it is. A question here from John from Virginia. Wonders about your process in writing poems about Paul Watson at the same time as writing the play, and I'd like to, I had the chamber opera, and how do you keep those separate, and how is that?
No, I don't really keep it separate very well, which is probably why the play is in some ways more like a poem, and the poems are in some ways like a play, or maybe like fiction at times. Sometimes those poems are almost like very short chapters in a novel or something. I'm very excited by a genre that I can't quite classify when I read other people's writing. So there's something, when I first started working with Paul, I said, I don't know if I'm going to write anything or if I'm going to be successful at writing something about you, but if I do, it should be strange. I want the reader, I want the audience, I want people to feel like there's something just not quite right about the experience of reading the poem. And part of that, I think, is this question of genre, something that... So I think of this entire endeavor with Paul Watson as the Paul Watson Project or the War Reporter Project, and I think of it less as individual. I mean, of course, when I'm working on it, I think of it as a play. When I'm working on the libretto, I think of it as a libretto. But I don't feel anxiety really to separate it too much. It's been strange. It has kind of taken over my creative life now for 7 or 8 years, and I sense it's wrapping up, but I don't really know for sure. I just feel very grateful because it was luck or fate or something that brought us together. So I feel lucky to have been able to spend that time working with his life.
There's a question here from someone called Whimsy, who wonders about the process of, this is for you again, Dan, who wonders about the process of running the play with different actors and venues, and do you keep iterating it, or is it totally done at some point?
I think like a lot of writers, I'm almost clinically obsessive compulsive, so I don't think a piece is ever really done. I mean, maybe eventually you give up on especially a play, because a play you can rework it, you can redraft it for new production. When a book is published, I often just don't want to read it again because there's nothing I can do about it. So it's kind of one of the wonderful things about plays is that you can fine-tune it. The production in London of this play was actually quite different from the premiere in the U.S. It was maybe 40 minutes shorter. It was played as a one-act play with no intermission, much more scaled back, scaled down design, and so that was a lot of changes for that. But the play was still a very new play. It only premiered once, and that first production often teaches you an enormous amount about the play. I think for this upcoming production, I'm sure there'll be some changing of the script, and some of it does have to do with different casts, but not usually. I mean, I think if the production is well cast, even if it's different, it'll still work with the text that you've got.
Okay. I've got one last question for you, Dan, from Josephine in England before I go back over to Rebecca. And Josephine asks, Dan, can she ask you about the form of 14 syllables a line in the War Poetry Collection? How or why did you decide on that form?
I've had enough time now to come up with a good reason, because at first, like most things, it was very just instinctive. I think part of it was adapting. Most of these poems are adapted either from things Paul has written to me, things Paul has written himself, or things I've recorded. I used a digital recorder every time I spent time with him. So they're even though they're poems, they're very close to documentary for me. And there was something about just having a very fixed, rigid form, in some ways a monotonous form, that helped me focus all of that material and helped me just continually focus down that material. It also, I think, one of the things that I think I didn't understand at the time, but I kind of have justified it this way now, is that I think that, and that's actually 10 syllables, it's a 10-syllable line, but of course, depending on how you pronounce certain things, it can be a little bit flexible. There's something about the 10-syllable line reminds me, at least of journalism, of what the column on the page in a newspaper. There's just something about the kind of pedestrian feel of that form that just felt right. It just didn't feel right to me to get too too much into different poetic forms.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Rebecca, I've got another question for you if you're there and can switch yourself back on. You're there. This it sort of relates to the last thing you mentioned about your pamphlet, about it being so long ago when there was not much internet and you were social media, and the models for shouting about yourself as a poet weren't really around for you. So Gareth is wondering, what do you think about these new business models for poetry that are cropping up at the moment? And is there one that if I can add, is there one that you think is working particularly well for you or for poets in general?
I think the way it's changed in the last 20 years is only a good thing for poets, really, and for the writing community and the writer's life, which is incredibly solitary. So I think that so much more can be shared and viewed and seen, and I think I like the way that I'm able to find out so much more about poets and new poets, and I can click on something and read a poem by them, or see something in the newspaper and then instantly go and find out another poem about them on the internet or their book, or all that was kind of unimaginable 20 years ago, to have all that at your fingertips. So I think the writing community and the poetry community can only really flourish with all these things. And when you said anything particular working for me, do you mean like Twitter or something like that?
Just the business models, yeah. I suppose the social media models or the online models.
Because I've just about got my head around Twitter, really. That's about all I do. I'm not on Facebook or anything like that. But yeah, I like online magazines, and the fact that yours is online as well, and even something like this is remarkable, really.
Well, this is a phenomenal thing. I'm delighted that we're able to do this evening, and thanks to Robert for setting it all up. And thanks, I suppose we are coming to the end, I think, are we not, Robert? And we've been on for an hour now, and we've had some amazing poetry from yourself, Rebecca, and from Dan. And it's just a shame there isn't more time to ask more questions of you both, I think, really. But I'd like to thank you both for being in this program this evening for people to watch online live. For both of you for being part of my new
I like online magazines, and the fact that yours is online as well. And
right, something strange just happened there for me. I just got a repeat of everything that you had. And thank you both for being part of the magazine. It's in its first year. And I guess, just thanks to everyone for watching and posing your questions, and to say to people who are watching now, who know people who haven't had the chance to watch, I think Robert puts this up online on his YouTube page on Peak Poetics for people to watch afterwards. A quick little plug for the magazine. Obviously, if you want to go and find out about the stuff that Rebecca and Dan have done in the magazine, you go to the website bearfictionmagazine.co.uk, and if you sign up for our newsletter, the first issue of the magazine, we've got a PDF version of that you can download, which has an interview that I did with Dan and two of Dan's new War Reporter poems that aren't in the collection, and of course Rebecca's poems, the 4 that she's had are in the 3rd issue of the magazine, which I'm afraid you'll have to pay for. So thanks very much to both of you. Thanks to Robert for asking me and Bear Fiction to host this evening, and I think Robert's going to now tell you about the next transatlantic poetry event, which will be happening very shortly from Ford's Review. Thank you both. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks to both of you. That was really lovely. And just a reminder that if you were as moved and provoked and inspired, frankly, by those poems as I was, do seek out these authors' books and purchase copies of their books. So our next poetry reading is coming up in September, on the 21st of September, hosted by Fjords Review. We will have Megan Imgar and M. Bartley Siegel. That's going to be happening at 8 p.m. here in the European time, 3 p.m. on the East Coast of America, and noon on the West Coast of America. You can get the archive of tonight's reading and all of our previous readings at transatlanticpoetry.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.